Well, hello, buddy. My name is Nate. If I haven't met you, I'm so happy that we get to be together. It's a little soggy out there. Oh my goodness, I feel like somebody moved Seattle to Billings or something like that. But it's gonna be green, right? It's gonna be green. Hey, we're starting a new series, which I'm excited about. We'll look through the summer months at the different parables of Jesus. And I just wanna take a few moments and kind of introduce the concept of parables. It's really interesting. When it comes to parables, there are whole books written about how to interpret parables because it's a tool that Jesus uses to communicate to people. And it wasn't just Jesus. In the first century, rabbis who were Hebrew teachers used parables. It was just one of the common methodologies. And so Jesus takes parables and he packs them with spiritual principles. So parables, you could loosely define it this way. They're stories with intent. Stories with intent. So when you read a parable, I think it's important that we understand Jesus isn't saying that this actually happened. He's saying, here's a scenario, here's a metaphor, here's a parable, and from the happenings within the parable, there are really important things we can learn about who human beings are, but more importantly about who God is. And there's just numbers of parables. The four biographies of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, contain tremendous amounts of parables. It was Jesus' most common way of teaching, please hear this, when he was in public places. So there's times when Jesus will teach a little bit more in a directed way, but that's typically just with his disciples. But when he's talking to crowds of people who are interested and who are asking questions, he most commonly speaks in parables. And here's what we're gonna look at this weekend. We're gonna look at the parable of the sower we're gonna read from the book of Mark chapter 4. And it's one of the longer parables in the scriptures. And it's very unique. This is why we're starting with this one, because after Jesus tells the parable, then he has a conversation with his disciples and explains the parable. And it's one of the only parables where we have Jesus' explanation. So what that does is it helps us to understand how do we interpret, how do we read, how do we understand parables. And so I'm excited to do that, but I just want to give you a couple of principles with parables because they are so unique. Here's a number of things. I've got 7 principles on parables from a really solid theologian by the name of Osborne. So here's the 7 things that are common in parables. Number 1, there's an earthiness to them. And what do I mean by earthiness? Well, earthiness means most of them are about things that people are very familiar with. A lot of them are about trees and plants and growing things. It's what common people, regardless of your level of education, they would all be familiar with the subject. So there's a relatability. Second characteristic of a parable is its conciseness. This is one of the longest parables, the one we're about to read. Some of the parables are just several sentences. But one of the teaching techniques was something short, and please think of this, in the first century, where one of the more expensive things that you could buy was something to write on. Paper hadn't been invented. Paper's like one of the cheapest things you can buy now. But you wrote typically on vellum. And vellum was a treated skin from either a goat or a sheep. And it was unbelievably expensive. The Egyptians had made papyrus out of a crushed reed, but that was astronomical. And so part of the purpose of a parable is that it's something that's concise enough that you could walk away from this interaction with Jesus and remember the parable. It was memorable in that way, so it's concise. Number 3 is repetition. There's typically not like 10 different subjects covered in a parable. Usually it pulls into 1 or 2 things, most of the time 1, and it repeats. In fact, Jesus oftentimes will tell multiple parables about the same subject matter. So there's this sense of repetition, again, most likely for the purpose of memory. So one of the most discouraging things when you do what I do is these studies that come out that say people forget 90 to 96% of what they hear within 24 hours of hearing it. That's bad news, right? If you're a pastor, that's like the worst. Well, Jesus understood that about human nature. And so he said things that were short and pithy, concise, and then he repeated himself. The fourth attribute of a parable is its listener relatedness, meaning it was personal. Okay, so earthiness meant it was something that everyone was familiar with. Listener relatedness, it meant this, that when you heard the parable, and I don't know if there's a parable I've ever read where I go, meh, that one doesn't apply to me. It's for everybody. Like if Jesus is going to tell a parable about money or about people or relationships or about the kingdom of God, it relates to every one of us. The fifth trait is a reversal of expectations. Now, we don't always capture this in the English, but one of the things, if you were a Hebrew in the first century, one of the things that Jesus does through his parables is he often throws a zinger. People are like, what? That's not how I thought that story would go. For example, Jesus is going to tell a story. He's going to use a parable about a wedding banquet. And in the wedding banquet, what you would expect is that, well, the popular, the wealthy, the well-to-do people are invited, and they don't end up showing up. And so Jesus says, so this is what the person who was throwing the banquet did. They went out and they went into all the slums. They went to all the places where disreputable people lived and said, why don't you come to the banquet? And if you were a first century Jew reading that, you'd be like, what? So there's often this sense of, it's a reversal of expectations. 6, kingdom-centered emphasis. Okay, now, over the summer, you'll figure out what this means, but a majority of parables are about Jesus describing what he calls the kingdom. This is an ongoing theme. So we'll actually look at several parables that are about the kingdom. So one of the things that Jesus was trying to do, and it actually fits with number 5, is if you were the original listeners in first century Israel, you had a couple of concepts of kingdom. One is you had a historical kingdom that you longed for and anticipated would one day come back. And that was the kingdom primarily under King David, where Israel was a national power, where they were free and not oppressed. And then after that, their history is just filled with occupation after occupation after occupation. And so you thought that about kingdom. And then the other thing you thought about when you thought about kingdom is you thought about Rome. Because Rome is the occupying power. And Rome, at that point, is the most powerful nation the earth had ever seen. From Canada to from Scotland to North Africa, from Portugal deep into even India. Can you imagine 2,000 years ago, a kingdom being that substantial and comprehensive? And so when you thought about kingdom, you thought about powerful people, you thought about armies. And one of the things that Jesus always does in these parables is he wants people to think about a kingdom that doesn't have to do with armies or thrones or taxes. And he keeps introducing this idea that God, through Jesus, has come to bring a new kingdom. So it's kingdom-centered. And the last characteristic, it's an invitation to deeper consideration. So most of the time, Jesus doesn't actually give us the interpretation of the parable. He just tells it, sometimes a quite cryptic parable, and then ends. People are like, what did that mean? Like, so why don't you just tell us straight? And Jesus says, no. Like, I want to mentally nudge you. I want you to walk away thinking about this and how it applies to your life. A parable was something that could keep you awake at night in bed. As you're like, now what did he mean by that? And it pushes us towards deeper consideration and more profound thinking. So those would be 7 characteristics of a parable. Now let's jump into our first parable. Again, this is Mark chapter 4. And we'll begin reading, then we're going to take a break because Jesus is going to explain the parable a little bit later. So Mark chapter 4, verse 1. Again, Jesus began to teach by the lake. The crowd that gathered around him, notice again, what's the context? It's a crowd of people. This is a big public gathering. Was so large that he got into a boat and sat in it out on the lake. So Jesus is gonna, if you're speaking to thousands, there's no amplification. Jesus didn't have one of these deals, right? So if you sat on a boat, your voice projects over the water. The Sea of Galilee is fascinating. Most places it slopes in, and kind of there's multiple places on the Sea of Galilee where it looks like a natural amphitheater. So that's probably exactly what Jesus is doing. While all the people were along the shore at the water's edge, he taught them many things by parables. And in his teaching said, listen, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants so that they did not bear grain. Still other seed fell on good soil. So there we have our multiple places where the seed can fall. It came up, grew, and produced a crop, some multiplying 30, some 60, some 100 times. Then Jesus said, whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. This is a really interesting phrase that Jesus uses quite often. And again, it's this nudging. It's this, I want you to consider this. I want you to think deeply than you typically think when you listen to the rabbis teach. When he was alone, the 12 and the others around him asked him about the parables. So this is why Mark chapter 4 is unique, because of what's about to follow. Most of the time, it would just be there. Just Jesus tells the parable, and then we have to kind of think through the parable. But Jesus is going to explain the parable to the 12, so this is the 12 disciples, and others who traveled with Jesus. He told them, the secret of the kingdom, right? There's our theme. The kingdom of God has been given to you. And they're like, well, we didn't understand the parable. And he says, oh, no, you've already been given the secret. But to those on the outside, everything is said in parables. So that, now I was going to quote from the book of Isaiah, the ancient prophet Isaiah. They may be ever seeing, but never perceiving, and ever hearing, but never understanding. Otherwise, they might turn and be forgiven. Then Jesus said to them, don't you understand this parable? How then will you understand any parable? A farmer sows the word. So he says, parable, okay, the farmer's sowing the seed, and he gives us the interpretation. He says, the seed is the word. Now, when we read the word in our setting, if you are a follower of Jesus, you think of the Bible, okay? So we often refer to this as the word. The word says, when Jesus is talking, he's not talking about the Bible. Of course, the New Testament hasn't even arrived, and he's not referencing even the Old Testament or the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. He's saying this, it's the truth of God. This truth that God communicates. So the farmer, God, sows the word. Some people are like seed along the path where the word is sown, and as soon as they hear it, Satan comes. Now in the original parable, nothing was mentioned of Satan. It was like it snatched up and takes away the word that was sown in them. Others, like seed sown on rocky places, hear the word and at once receive it with joy, but since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, notice that the word is the thing that brought about the trouble or persecution, they quickly fall away. Still others, like seed sown among thorns, hear the word, but the worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the desires for other things come in and choke the word, making it unfruitful. Others, like seed sown on good soil, hear the word, accept it. So they hear, and then there's this act of volition. There's a choice. They don't just hear, everybody heard it, right? They hear it and they accept it. So now we're starting to understand what good soil is. It's about receptivity. It's about openness. It takes humility to be able to understand new truth and produce a crop some 30, some 60, some 100 times what was sown. With many similar, so we're going to jump ahead. With many similar parables, Jesus spoke the word to them as much as they could understand. So Jesus understood this, really? This is good for all of us, okay? Jesus understands our limited capacities, wherever we're at. If you are, I love this, if you are spiritually unresolved and you're just trying to figure out what you believe, here's what Jesus will do for you. He'll teach you as much as you can currently understand. And if you are a veteran disciple of Jesus and you have dynamically increased your capacity, he'll teach you as much as you can understand. I think that's an ongoing promise. No matter how long you followed him, here's what Jesus will do. He'll teach you as much as you can understand. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. It was instrumental in his teaching ministry. It's really important. We're jumping ahead to verse 33 and 34. But when he was alone with his own disciples, he explained everything. So we've got the crowds, and Jesus is speaking to them in parables. And you've got even the disciples aren't fully comprehending the parables, but there's this sense of it's trying to nudge them towards something. But how many people would love to sit down with Jesus after a long day of traveling and hearing him teach, and you get to have I imagine a campfire, and you're like, hey, Jesus, what you said today was fantastic, but we didn't understand. Could you just tell us what that was all about? And you just have these moments alone with Jesus where he explains things. Interestingly, in the original Greek language, it's the same language that's used to when you have a rope that's tied in a knot. That he untied the knots with them. There were points of confusion in their mind where things weren't clear. And Jesus, at the end of the day, said, hey, let's just be together, just me and my disciples, and let me start to untie your knots, your confusion, the things that you have believed about God, but it wasn't actually accurate. Let me set the record straight. Let me give you clarity. So let's just walk through the parable a little bit, and then I have some points there, some questions for us. So the farmer is sowing seed. It's point number one. And this is great news, because the question is, where does truth come from, right? Where do human beings find truth? This is a question that human beings have been asking in literature since we first began to write things. What is truth? Where do I find truth? Who is truth? What do I believe? In a world where somebody can create a YouTube video that looks really legitimate and they can tell you something crazy, you gotta know what is actually true. And I love that in this parable, Jesus sets the Father up this way. He says, the Father is sowing truth, the word. He loves to distribute it. He loves to pour it into people's lives. He loves to help open our eyes. The search for truth. Notice that the soil wasn't seeking the truth. So it's not up to me to be like, it's my responsibility, my mental capacities to find truth. No, God is just generously sowing truth. He wants to sow truth into your life. He wants to sow truth into my life. He's a generous truth giver. And it's this word, it's the seed is the word. And the seed has potential. Anytime that God distributes truth into a human being's life, that truth, it's not just something that I understand and then like I've got that. Okay, now I know that truth. Jesus says this, when God speaks to you, all right, and I know this is really difficult. Some of us are like, I've been wanting all my life to hear God speak. And some people are like, I heard God this week. And some of us like are dying to hear God speak. I find the vast majority of the time when God speaks the word to me, he speaks it through this book. And every time he speaks it through this book, that word has potential. It's not just something that I catch and accumulate. So the goal isn't to become like an encyclopedia of biblical things. It's not a collection. Is when that word comes in, it has the potential. So perhaps Brooks just led us in prayer time, and he mentioned people who are feeling deep grief. Perhaps in the midst of my grief, God speaks truth to me about his omnipotence, his power in the midst of situations where I feel powerless. Now, I could take that truth and just cognitively believe it, or Jesus seems to be saying this, you can let that truth be deposited in your life, and it's not just a new point of knowledge for you. There's the potential for that new comprehension, that revelation from God to begin to grow in your life. And to begin to help you to understand how you work through the next difficult thing ahead of you. Because something was planted and then it grew, and now I've come to a place of greater maturity and I can handle the next challenge better than I handled this challenge because something was planted and then it grew in my life. And there's different types of growth. There can be minimal growth, 30, 60, or even 100. Different things are planted in my life and they produce different things, different amounts, but nonetheless, they all produce something. Every time I hear the word, okay, that I hear truth, maybe it's you're in a conversation with somebody you respect and they just say something and you realize, man, I think that is truth from God. You're reading your Bible, something stands out. The Spirit of God is teaching and mentoring you. Every time something stands out, it's God distributing truth into your life, and it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to embrace it. It's an opportunity for increase and development. So I know this is a bit, like even talking about this can be a bit esoteric. Let me give you a personal example. So like every time I've been through a really challenging thing in my life, I go back to these verses. Okay, they're truth that God has given me. I've memorized them, and I personally call them prophetic promises. Okay, prophetic promises in my life. And the next time I face a similar challenge, something had been deposited and grown in my life, and I know how to face that challenge because somewhere in the past, God deposited a truth that helped me to address whatever it is I'm facing. And over time, if these things continue to be deposited and grow, there's opportunity for growth in your life, it can just make life a little bit easier. Like I know what to do when I'm worried, right? Because I memorized Matthew chapter 6, where Jesus says, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow has enough worries in and of itself. Who of you, by worrying, could add even an hour onto the length of your life? It goes on and on and on. Right? So there's opportunity. The development of the seed has everything to do with the reception it receives. So the seed is deposited, right? but how it's received is going to impact what that word actually does. Now, there's that interesting quote from Isaiah chapter 6 that we need to talk about for a moment, because you read it and you're like, what? I tell them stories so that they'll not really know anything. And here's what I think Jesus is doing. He's looking back at Isaiah. In Isaiah, one of the hallmarks of Isaiah's life is he felt like he was constantly warning people and teaching people about God, and they were always rejecting and not listening. So Jesus is referencing what they were very familiar with in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah was this guy that would stand up and say, guys, it's self-destructive. Don't do that. Don't do that. And everybody would be like, yeah, that guy's crazy. And they do it anyway. So Jesus seems to be saying this. I'm speaking in parables to create, because their eyes aren't opened yet. For the disciples, he says, you understand the secret of the kingdom. But the crowds, they don't understand the secret of the kingdom. They don't understand that Jesus came to create a new kingdom. The crowds, are still looking for a nationalistic warrior to come on the scene. They're looking for somebody to chase away bad Romans. And Jesus says, no. The secret of the kingdom is something different. So in many ways, it would be like this. What if Jesus said this instead of the parable we just read? What if he said, God is speaking, you should listen? And that was the end of the teaching. They're like, okay. But I guarantee you wouldn't remember that. But if Jesus tells a parable that has a vagary to it that arouses curiosity, well, now this parable has been read for 2,000 years and people are still trying to understand it. If the sermon would have been, God speaking, you should listen, it would not be nearly as impactful. So Jesus is urging us, bringing us in. So we've got the seed down. Let's move on to the path. I'm going to move through these quickly because I have a couple of questions at the end. So the path, it's ground that has been hardened by traffic, right? You just don't plant your garden. You don't plant your flower beds like on your sidewalk. Not much is going to happen there. So it's probably what Jesus is referring to. It's familiarity. And listen, for all of us that have been around for a little while, okay, if you're spiritually unresolved, this probably doesn't apply to you. But here's one of the challenges. If you've been studying and reading the Bible for a lot of years, sometimes we read passages, we hear God speak truth, we hear things at church, you hear something on the radio, and you've heard that over and over for 30 years. And the familiarity has created a pathway which is compact and hardened, and the seed has no capacity to take root. So a lot of times what long-term Christians need is a good rototilling. You know what a rototiller is? Oh man. My dad bought one when I was a kid and he was a school teacher. So we had this summer business of rototilling, and I'm like a little kid running these. He's got the tines that dig up the earth. And I'll tell you, they're a little bit rough to run, but what do they do? And if you came across something that had been hardened for a long time, you had to take a lot of passes. And you only went a couple inches at first. Sometimes those of us who follow Jesus for a long time, we've become overly familiar with some of these incredible concepts. And we need to be rototilled. We need to break up that hard ground, the path. And here's what Jesus says. It's the only time that Satan is mentioned. By the way, this story is retold in the book of Matthew. I believe it's chapter 13. And Matthew says that the bird snatched it away because it's not understood. It's not understood. So part of what this path is when things are not comprehensible, when it's confusing and unclear, that's the only opportunity that Satan has to come in and snatch things away before it can take root. And so one of the themes around this church is this: we really try to focus on, we don't call ourselves being seeker sensitive. We just focus on this. We try to be comprehensible. Because Christians can create a subculture. You can create a church service where people have no idea what you're talking about. But it sounds complicated, right? And it sounds impressive. Jesus Is there anybody who didn't at least understand the basic concepts of the parable of the sower? Was there anybody in the crowd who was like, no, what's a seed? I don't understand. What's a path? No. What Jesus said was comprehensible. He goes, and if you don't speak in a comprehensible fashion, if you speak way over people's heads and you're trying to impress, it's an opportunity for the bird, the Satan, to come in and snatch that seed away. So the path. Then we got rocky places. It's limited soil, which leads to limited roots, right? Here's the thing about rocks. I'm a gardener. Like, I've got a whole organic little garden on my property that's surrounded by an electric fence because I have so many deer. The thing about a rock is the first time you find it, you've done this with a shovel. Kunk. And you do not know if that rock is this big or this big, right? But what rocks do is they're impenetrable. You cannot get a plant to grow there. All the work we've been doing at Camp on the Boulder, oh my goodness. There's a reason they call it the Boulder River. I just wanted you to know if you're ever curious why. But you should see, we've been digging holes, and sometimes you hit something and you'll get a rock that's like as big as a Yugo. Anybody remember what a Yugo is? I don't know why that came to mind. Big as a small car. And you're like, what do I do? How do we get around it? Rocks, they just create a barrier. So one of the things you have to do is you have to remove rocks. These hard things that will keep soil from ever being able to accumulate in that spot. It's the toughness that develops in my own heart. Maybe it's wounds that I've experienced where I can't go there. I can't let God go there. I just ignore that. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to deal with it. Rocky places. So you always have to be involved in rock removal. The next is the thorns. And the thorns are all about what? It's competition. This is the seed takes root, and then the thorns grow up, and eventually what happens? The thorns always outcompete what you want to grow. I've been a gardener for a lot of years. I have never planted a weed. And I've pulled tens of thousands of them, right? You know that. Anybody, you got a flower bed? You're like, how do these always grow? I can't get the things I want to grow, but the things I don't want grow like crazy. I was out in my garden the other day, and I'm like, what is that? It was a Russian olive. These are raised bed gardens, and this Russian olive root was this big. It had come up into my raised bed. I'm out there just poison it, kill it, chop it. Don't like those things. But weeding is a constant thing. And here's the problem with weeds. Have you ever noticed this? You want to get them while they're young. Huh? Because the bigger they get, the harder they are to pull. And so weeds, it's a regular thing. I always got to be in this process of weeding my life because the competition, it's interesting. Jesus says it's the worries of this life, it's the deceitfulness of wealth, and this longing for other things. It ends up choking away the life that God wants to plant in me. And then lastly is this good soil. Good soil is the productive soil. Good soil is receptive. Good soil needs to be worked. If you do any farming, you have to amend your soil. Over time, if you're not careful, you can pull the nutrients out of your soil. So you add things to the soil, you rest your soil, because good soil is a beautiful thing, but it's not easy to find. That's why you like compost and all that. What is it? It's meant to make your soil healthy so there's fruitfulness. And Jesus is saying this: have healthy soil. Be good soil, so that your life can be productive when God distributes truth into it. That you can be receptive and you just don't accumulate new truth, but truth grows and develops within you. So here's my questions. What type of soil am I? When I was a kid, and even probably going into my 20s, I always read this parable. And I thought, oh, this is obviously about any time people hear the gospel, the good news of Jesus, right? And that is true. That is true. So, like, you imagine you're at a Billy Graham crusade, okay? And there's 20,000 people in this place, and the seed's being spread, and like your buddy you brought next to you, obviously he's the hard path because he's not even listening. And you're just thinking about how do people respond to the gospel. And so I think that is true. But here's what I've come to understand. This is the beauty of parables, right? As much as I can understand, Jesus will teach me. I've come to this conclusion that I am potentially all forms of soil at all times. I just got back from a 4-day, 100-year anniversary for the family of churches that we're part of down in LA. And I got to be, it's awesome. I got to be there where you are, and other people were up here. And it was just such a reminder as I'm thinking about this parable. I sit there, I think, I just want to be good soil. Because I've got like 8 people teaching me. And I had to think through like, oh, if I'm thinking about what that person is wearing, or how young they are, or how old they are, or how boring they are, I'm not good soil. And so for me, this is how I was good soil. I get a pen, I get a notebook, and I'm like, I just want to learn. Teach me something, even if I don't like your style. I trust it was something through what you're teaching is going to be there. And so this would be actually a daily reality in my life too. I can pick up this book and I can have a devotional time that is absolutely taken over by the thorns. I can read, have you ever done this? I can read an entire chapter of the Bible and have no idea what it said at the end of my devotions. Anybody else? Honest, please, yeah. Because what? I was thinking about all the worries, all the things I've got to do. Like, oh yeah, I got to do that. So, I can't stop myself from doing that. So you know what I do? I always have this one little book. It's like my to-do book. And as soon as it comes into my mind, I stop reading, I write that thing down. So that I can like go back to just being good soil. What type of soil are you? I think constantly we've got to be pulling weeds. We've got to be removing rocks. We've got to be tilling it so that we can be good soil. Second question is this: how do I communicate? So sometimes we're taught when we want to talk to somebody about Jesus, we're taught to do it in a way where I think half the time they're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Just think about how Jesus talked about himself or how he talked about his Father. He talked about his Father in a way where people go, I might not agree with you, but I understand you. I understand you. And so when you're talking to a friend or a neighbor about who Jesus is, like you don't have to talk about substitutionary atonement and propitiation from sin, because they're going to be like, Find a way to connect normal life and infuse it with spiritual truth. That's what Jesus did. This governs our teaching. I'm working with all of our young teachers around here. Like, people have to understand what you're saying. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. And then lastly, this is a question for all of us. Am I alone with Jesus to let him explain everything? I love that last verse 34, where it says, but when they were alone with Jesus, he explained everything. He untied the knots. So, like, I'm so happy you came to church this weekend. I really am. I'm just so happy. But I'd be happier if you got away with Jesus and let him explain the things that I messed up. He's just a way better teacher. And that dynamic, I think, still continues. In part, I think this is my job, is to get away with Jesus. Say, Jesus, would you please explain things to me? So that I can do my best to explain them to others. Then the next step is you take it and you just get alone with Jesus and let him explain it to you. Let him sow that seed deep into your heart. It's not about knowledge. It's about receptivity of truth that develops and grows into something that's fruitful.